Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Shino Takayama from the School of Economics. Today, I want to welcome everyone to the 2024 Economic Thought Leadership webinar, How to Revive National Competition Policy, an Attack on Inflation and Anemic Productivity. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land on which we meet today. On behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. You will notice we have closed captioning enabled to make this webinar more accessible to all viewers. If you'd like to turn these on or off, you can do so by clicking the live transcript button below and following the prompts. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, please submit these to the Q&A function below, and these will be addressed during the Q&A part of today's webinar. I would now like to introduce today's speaker. Peter Harris-Ayo is an industry fellow in the School of Economics at the University of Queensland. As the former chairman of the Australian Productivity Commission from 2013 to 18, instrumental in the economy-wide productivity review, shifting the dial in 2017. Prior to that, he managed the Public Policy Department development aspects of the National Broadband Network as Secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Broadband from 2009 to 2013. In his earlier career, Peter served as Senior Private Secretary, handling microeconomic reform for then Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke, advising the Hilmer Inquiry on National Competition Policy, and in senior positions in both state and Commonwealth departments, designing policy reform in rail, road, aviation, and water policy. Peter has a Bachelor of Economics from the University of Queensland, and in 2013 was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for contributions to effective public policy design, including national competition policy. We are delighted to have Peter speak for us today, and with that, I will now hand it over. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for this. So what we're going to do today is pro-competition policy, how we once did it and the fact that it worked. The fact that today is different, but why that's not a problem. But what different means for a new form of national competition policy, what the new barriers to entry might be that a national competition policy could address. And if we have time, I'm going to talk about why extreme actions don't work, particularly the forced divestiture thing, which seems to be such a fantastically populist topic of commentary at the moment. So first off, I'm motivated to do this thought leadership discussion today by a deep sense of frustration at some glib and populist notions that dominate public discussion, how to address this Australian generation's first serious experience with high inflation, elevated interest rates, and an overall higher cost of living. In the language of today, so I've read, these adverse circumstances have even achieved a mem of their own, cosy lives, which the Macquarie Dictionary people and social media together assure me means an important national mood shift against the high cost of living. Serious indeed then. Yet it seems the higher the seriousness, the dumber the policy discourse. We first had fuel price subsidies from Scott Morrison's government, and they lasted about a year, and we got used to elevated fuel prices. We've had electricity subsidies, and apparently they're about to be renewed. In my day-to-day work now in financial markets, I read that this renewal of subsidies indicates to some private economic forecasters that the interest rates will arrive even sooner. Seriously, as if the Reserve Bank of Australia is not going to look right through those subsidies and know where real prices are actually going and not vary interest rates at all accordingly. And now we have an outbreak of supermarket bashing to go along with our traditional bank bashing. Both these sectors, of course, always seem to invite a good bashing, as they repeatedly display confirmatory behaviour and the characteristics of dominant firm syndrome. I'm not here today to offer my sympathy to them, but I do find it quite disgraceful that politicians use the opportunity to float wild ideas of retribution for a circumstance, high inflation, for which some of these same politicians are to a degree responsible, all well-intentioned, of course, and where the solutions hyped in the media are clearly unable to alter in any sense the pricing impact of cosy lives. The most recent is this forced divestiture of supermarket sites, which I'll come back to at the end of the discussion. Our political leaders should be much better than this, and our media, the professional part of it anyway, should be much better too, because from both there's no real attempt at sceptical thought in their public commentary about how these ideas could ever realistically address the cost of living. They're more likely to increase compliance costs in a market where dominance would otherwise remain unchallenged by such ideas. So to be clear today, I'm concerned primarily with how ideas like these substitute for decent policy thinking, and along with that, amount to a deception of consumers. If you don't introduce change that genuinely challenges market power, you merely add a new way to see lawyers employed. And I've got nothing personally against lawyers, my elder daughter is one. But it's just deceptive to market these notions as in any way likely to change what fundamentally matters. For governments in time of crisis, the deep temptation is to regulate something. Now, why is that? Well, governments only have three mechanisms to influence any situation they face. They have money, they have regulation, less or more, but usually it's more, and they have persuasion. Persuasion requires credibility and so often isn't in use, and money's always in short supply, whereas there's a near inexhaustible opportunity to pass new laws. So when we discuss competition policy in Australia today, we talk up the options for strengthening merger laws or fixing the effects test or the dominance test. Maybe we'll see the revival of the unlimited prices justification tribunal. You should Google that. It's from a report earlier this year. It still has its supporters. Many of these improvements to consumer law are probably necessary, I don't doubt. My concern is that politics has limited attention for any topic. And regarding competition, it's the laws that always get the limited attention, not competition itself. We have no policy in favour of new competition, as once we had with national competition policy. So aside from fixing the Consumer and Competition Act, the most we have in what passes for competition policy today is the big stick. Actually, we have a number of big sticks. We have the gas export big stick, the supermarket divestiture big stick, and maybe soon we'll have the supermarket code big stick with its big fines. The agency of choice at federal level for waiving the big sticks is the ACCC. Yet the ACCC's genuine capabilities lie in setting market rules, and we should all be grateful for an effective arbiter of fair market conduct. Its principal test, though, in doing so, is about preventing the substantial lessening of competition, not, let me repeat, not the increasing of competition, nor the delivery of outcomes that we want that stronger competition to provide. These are the core responsibilities of markets themselves and the public policy efforts of governments. But today, governments and oppositions are leaning ever more heavily on the imagery of big sticks and the ability to leverage the credibility of the ACCC as the keeper of the ring. That's an old boxing analogy, not about Frodo and the Elvish. And make it the persuader of choice. And by that, take the pressure off government itself to actually implement what I call pro-competitive policies. So in gas exports, that will be government action to increase gas supply. In big tech, that would be a change in taxation rules and the redirection of funds towards preferred sources of journalism. In supermarkets, well, that's be something I'm going to talk about in a little more detail later on in this address. Every time one of these big sticks proves to be just a twig, the relevant parties are sure to be deeply disappointed. And to date, those disappointed parties have mainly been other businesses. But now we're trying out the idea of the big stick on supermarket prices. And the people we're trying to fool with it are voters. That's pretty high-risk stuff. This heavy dependence by governments on threats and constant whack-a-mole changes to the Competition and Consumer Act is simply insufficient in an environment with high levels of market concentration in consumer services and angry consumers. My topic today is about going to do more than that. It's the desirability in a time of persisting inflation and cost of living pressures of applying the kind of pro-competitive tool that requires governments to act to solve the problem, not divert attention from it. because only governments can take policy or deregulatory decisions that might enable new competitors to emerge, change the competitive structure of markets where under behaviour, otherwise price rises are simply a conveyor belt down the supply chain with margins added. Our political class on both sides and much of our bureaucracy that works in this area has for too many years put most of its eggs in the basket of adding to legislation and not much at all in the harder task of assessing how to improve new competitors' ability to compete. 2 and a bit firms is a common descriptor of many key consumer services markets in Australia today. International competition can offset domestic structures like that to a degree, and we have a long history in Australia of ensuring that cross-border trade ensures an additional amount of competitive pressure. But international competitive pressure is much harder to maintain in services, unlike goods, and the services that characterise our inflation today, rent, power, mortgages, insurance, residential building, meals out, entertainment, are much less exposed to it. So we need to look at domestic barriers to competition. Long time ago, back in the late 80s and the early 90s, we faced the same conundrum with the added burden of high unemployment. We had high inflation, low business investment, weak adoption of innovation, and we chose, amongst other things, to directly, with the clearly stated objective of a predisposition to increasing competition, to review all of Australia's multi-decades-long accretion of barriers to domestic competition. And we set it up as a project. Not just the usual press releases or speeches, no more long-lasting as the breeze in which they blow, but a structure for change making with minimal new bureaucracy and a maximum incentive to perform. And I'll offer you a little bit more detail on this later. The guiding principles for that process of national competition policy came from an external review, the Hilmer Review, triggered by common consent among state and Commonwealth leaders acting together. I helped in that design effort. Since today's lecture is part of a leadership series here at UQ, I will say, now that's leadership. It was brave and it was novel, and somewhat surprising to those at the time who saw it as trivial or radical, or often both, during my process of recruiting for it and doing some backroom design stuff. The damn thing actually worked. It lifted incomes and changed cost of living pressures, and I'll show you that in a moment. It was also disruptive. Change that sweeps away mistakes always is. But we've learned how to be better at handling disruption if we try this again today. And so the simple takeout from my talk will be that we have most of this century had insufficient focus on what I'm going to call pro-competition policies. We've had plenty of effort at improving anti-competitive laws and slowing the substantial lessening of competition, but not much new competition to show for it. And that's because it's much harder to coordinate policy activities across portfolios, across states, to boost competition than it is to draft a new bill. Most of you probably signed up for this talk thinking you knew me in the context of my efforts at the Productivity Commission. It's a complex thing to link competition with productivity. I will, therefore, spend most of my time on the new competition policy, but the fact is that competition policy did change productivity back when we last tried it. So we had a competition policy construct that worked in this country. Today, it's the fashion to say we can't, because today the economy is different. Well, so it is. And so what? Because the power of competition created by the removal of impediments to it and policies to invite new competitors is unaltered since the time of Adam Smith. It still works. It just requires in every age a bit more imagination and a bit more structure to fit local conditions. Of course, many of the reforms in that distant time of the 80s and 90s are indeed not repeatable. You can't float the dollar again. You can't open up the telecom monopoly. I could go on and list them all. But national competition policy is repeatable. Let me show you how. It was a project that enjoyed all the virtues of being set up as a sustained attack on uncompetitive markets. It had clear principles from the Hilmer Review. It had people at senior level in Commonwealth and state accountable for those things. It had regular working groups focused on known key areas with high barriers to entry or additional supply, like in agricultural marketing or the professions, transport and communications, insurance, urban planning. It had incentives for good performance and disincentives for bad, and an ongoing public process of scrutiny. The thing is, without national competition policy, we knew back then there was no entity, state or Commonwealth, given the role of questioning those kinds of redundant restrictions that applied across our economy, and so no one did until national competition policy provided that opportunity for review. The evidence is that, and you can see it in this slide that's up there at the moment, for the decade after national competition policy was launched, Australia recorded the highest productivity lift in 40 years. Multi-factor productivity had a 2 or even 3 in front of it over much of that decade versus the 0 in front of it, more common today. Household incomes increased by more than $7,000. The basic estimate of the Productivity Commission, which wasn't involved in developing national competition policy, so it wasn't marking its own homework, after the process was finalised in 2005, said that it had lifted GDP by between 2.5 and 5 percentage points. That's a couple of years of free national income growth, and doesn't account at all for substantial dynamic efficiency gains of increasing resource availability to new sectors like education, exports, or international tourism, or new uses for mobile telephony, which were just getting started in that period. As unit labour costs declined with higher productivity, household incomes still grew due to better redistribution policies. Unemployment headed towards a 5 after a decade near a 10. We move to the next slide. You'll see that these improvements were substantially in excess of our OECD peers and competitors internationally. The downward decline in our post-war economic fortunes, which is demonstrated in this slide, was reversed, and we avoided becoming, as the then Prime Minister of Singapore was said to have suggested, the poor white trash of Asia. Business investment, updating the capital stock that workers needed to become more productive, grew substantially as a proportion of GDP. Perhaps we'll put up the next slide that shows that. However, things have been declining since national competition policy ended in 2005. It sure isn't the only reason for business investment to start declining, but it is one. Productivity growth has halved since 2005 as well and continues to decline. For the past decade, in fact, in business investment, until very recently with an outburst after COVID, our business investment has been no better than in the recession era of the early 1990s. That means businesses in general, and there are exceptions, mining is a standout, just haven't been feeling the incentives, including competitive pressures, to invest. I acknowledge that today is different from the 1990s. We can't hanker for the policies of the past. But a better case for considering whether a new national competition policy is a good idea can be made around the elapse of time and the changes it has wrought on Australia than simply considering that competition once worked but can't work anymore. For most people on this call, I'm sure the 1990s feels a lifetime away, yet most of you still know by name the prime ministers of that age, Hawke and Keating and Howard, and there's a reason for that. They led this economy through a time at least as difficult as this one. I knew them too, and somewhat more personally. People of my generation need to be very careful to recognise that the past is truly a different country. Since we're talking virtually today at the University of Queensland, I want to acknowledge that when I started in economics in 1973, World War II was as distant from me then as in 2024, Fred Hilmer's report on national competition policy was in 1994, a 30-year period of difference. And in 1973, I only knew World War II from movies. I had no lived experience. No one's made a movie about national competition policy. So I'm very conscious that this can all seem very remote. But in economics, we still apply ideas today from the 1890s and the 1930s and the 1960s. You can ask an economic historian about them. Those ideas still work today. As you heard from the introduction, I'm not lost in the policy Camelot because I continued on after the 1990s working in economic policy reform, introducing new competition in aviation, private train and tram services, contracts operating effectively in Melbourne, water reforms across the Murray-Darling Basin, helping the NBM become a reality, and then 6 years at the Productivity Commission. I don't feel that I'm out of touch, and I do acknowledge the economy has changed. The issues we face are very similar. So what does that mean for a new attempt on competition policy? The characteristics of the economy today versus that of the 1990s could be as long a list as you like. I see these as the biggies. 10 percentage points more of our economy is in services than it was in the 90s. We're now 80% a services society on a production basis. Parts of this shift have occurred in manufacturing. Software as a service is now clearly as its name says, a service, but things have changed markedly for consumers too. We had no childcare businesses back then. Our tourism spend was much lower. Transport and logistics and other services become noticeably a larger part of the value of goods, with home delivery being a completely new industry. And although we all know implicitly about the growth and the value of mining, the non-market economy, health, education, childcare, aged care, the NDIS, is the fastest growing part of our economy. It's worth repeating that. The non-market economy is the fastest growing part of our economy. In the 1990s, it was less than 20% of GDP. Today, it approaches 30%. And as my former agency, the Productivity Commission, noted last year, it's consequently now mathematically impossible for the sectors expanding at the rate that non-market services are, and not likely to stop due to demographic shifts, to restore national productivity to even half the level of 1990s, which happens to be the assumed rate both Treasury and RBA now have in their growth forecasts, without serious efficiency gains across those non-market services. And then finally, we have digital data and the disruption that's occurred, Google, Airbnb, Uber, Amazon, with AI, the latest installment. So there are big structural differences. But as I say, the issues are not dissimilar that we face today. In the broad public sphere, we resent the policies, higher interest rates, reduced public spending growth, removing planning restrictions to allow for better located housing, being used to offset these problems. The media fans our discontent, and we're being set up for just do something solutions like the big sticks. And in economics, we like to say that productivity is a measure of what we don't know about the economy, because you can only see the connectivities in the big licks that occur well after the change has been introduced, big licks like I showed you a little earlier. I used to tell my treasurers, I had 3 of them in my time as chairman of the PC, that unlike macroeconomic policy change, where you can often see the results in short order, in microeconomic changes, you're building a legacy for someone else. The Howard government was probably the biggest political beneficiary of the Hawke and Keating micro reforms. In politics, this kind of policy reality probably isn't the best way to win friends and influence people. Most treasurers understand that theirs is the thankless task of doing the right thing by the future, even at that cost. Thus, it's a rare pleasure to be able to say to a treasurer, as I could to Jim Chalmers if he was here today, this policy in favour of new sources of competition clearly works, and competition sustained can lift productivity as it did a generation ago. Some of you will know that Treasurer recently announced the elimination of remaining tariffs on 500 imported items. And this is an estimated cost of revenue of $30 million. That's immaterial, really. Does it make it undesirable? No, it doesn't. Mostly because it indicates to me that somewhere in the body politic, there is still an awareness that something that once unleashed serious competitive effects could do so again, but it's not tariff cuts. There are other small indications the ground in which I cast this seed might not be completely barren. The Treasurer last month asked the Productivity Commission to prepare some modelling on measures yet to be specified which might tackle shared priorities such as addressing cost of living pressures. I don't know any more about this than you do. I just saw the announcement, but I do hope for serious change in the form of a new national project. The future for competition is not going to be about tariffs or indeed some of our past failures. Chemists and taxis and the like, which escaped national competition policy originally, but have subsequently been returned into a somewhat more competitive environment by technology. New competition policy is going to be about eliminating new impediments created since the 1990s, reducing the fear of change through technology, and updating regulation to deal with services provision in a digital world. Indeed, the whole concept of barriers to entry with its implied focus on regulation is much too narrow for today. I quite like the New Zealand Commerce Commission's standard for market studies on competitive market entry, which instead poses the question more along the lines of asking what can be done to improve any or all of the necessary conditions for entry and expansion in a particular market. I did some work on New Zealand in supermarket competition by coincidence a couple of years ago, and that'll be relevant to something I say in a minute on supermarket competition. A final point before I move to some out-of-the-box examples of what a new pro-competitive agenda might look like is that amongst politicians, there's always been, in my experience, a natural optimism to imagine that things are going to get better. Wait for a while and the cost of living crisis will pass. Financial market betting and politicians are together seeming to believe that this cycle of inflation will die a quiet death, maybe this year, maybe early next year. Soon enough anyway to not need to do much more by way of serious policy reform. Personally, I'm unconvinced it will, because we have such concentrated markets in so many principal consumption items that interest rate settings necessary to keep a lid on asset price speculation, alongside desirable real wage improvements that we haven't seen for a while, are together not going to be offset by anaemic productivity growth. And that's particularly in an economy undergoing a climate-induced transition, which is forcing strong new public infrastructure investment. One more reason I hope you'll think to give active pro-competition policy a serious go. So what modern barriers to competing should new competition policy then address? I'm going to give you some examples. None of them are what I call the usual suspects, restrictions that have been visited many times before, but for various reasons have escaped pro-competitive policy shift. My purpose today is instead to add some novelty in its finest sense to a discussion of a future NCP project, rather than remind governments once again of the things they have missed. As I do so, I'd like you to think about them as being illustrative of a new way to look at factors that restrict competition. They're not fully formed policies, but they're indicators of where a national reform process might head. And crucially, I'd like to advocate one other thing before I get down to specifics, and that is to remind you that the original NCP was a commitment to a process, rather than a one-off stab at change that traditionally our national government, with its short 3-year life, feels is all it can undertake. If a new NCP is to work, the one thing we need, alongside confidence that this has worked before, is a structure that can survive changes of government. The original NCP survived from Hawke and Keating and Greiner and Goss and Kinnett in its startup phase, through their replacement by Howard and Fay and Burbidge and Bracks, and yet the process continued. It had a tiny secretariat and appointed leadership from the National Competition Council, but it had those working groups that I referred to earlier, and that rewards process that energised state treasuries to ensure that their bureaucracies too took the requirement to undertake reform seriously. Prime ministers and premiers led this last time. I don't know that we can hope for that again. Their roles have become so much more presidential since we last had a go at this. But embedding a process that can survive inevitable democratic change should not be beyond us. So these topics are, first, I'm going to start with supermarkets. It probably wasn't my preference when I agreed to do this talk, but it's ground zero today in the discussion about competition, and so I couldn't leave it off the list. The ACCC's last review of supermarkets back in 2008 found there was workable competition, so clearly if we think it's not working today, something has changed. The crucial conditions for effective competition, not just barriers to entry, but the broader definition used in the New Zealand studies that I referred to a little earlier, can be found in competition regulator reports produced since 2008, both in the UK and then recently in New Zealand. We could make that list long, but in supermarkets, here are the essentials. You must be present in competitive locations. You must have the ability to resupply those locations efficiently, as consumers have come to expect continuous availability of product, or we get things like toilet paper meltdowns. We need good value, although this varies sufficiently among consumers for it not to simply be equated to low prices, and we will need a reliable wholesale supply option, particularly covering all the items normally sought in a weekly shop. To be competitive, these things have to be found at scale, as the investment requirements of gaining preferable locations and resupply logistics are high and fixed, and the ability to create good value and have reliable wholesale supplies is underwritten by scale purchasing. But new sources of competition arriving with scale are rare. However, in Australia, in 2018, we did have the experience of a new competitor coming in to assess our market. Kaufland, a European chain, a little more like Costco than Aldi, as I understand it, but clearly a strong competitor with a capacity to enter at scale. Kaufland was reported to have committed $500 million to entering this market, but it suddenly withdrew in 2020 after a painful experience acquiring 20 sites and commencing construction of a large distribution centre. The reasons for the withdrawal were not made public as far as I'm aware, despite the ACCC seeking to discover them. The withdrawal was preceded COVID by a few months, which was commercially fortuitous for Kaufland, I'm sure, but just coincidental. Since Kaufland could solve in its own right 3 of the 4 principal factors for effective competition I listed above, It seems that sites are at least part of the reason for this competitive threat fading away, so I would start from there. The planning conditions, urban transport issues that restrict resupply of sites in Australia are state issues. They make the task for new competitors much harder. As multiple retail industries commented at the time of Kaufland's withdrawal, there was widespread relief that it was leaving as it was removing a new force for competitive prices. This is the very thing that governments say they are looking for in retail competition. So I would strongly suggest that urban restrictions on new retail sites, urban planning restrictions, are a primary issue for a new competition policy agenda. Moving away from today's ground zero and towards defining characteristics of a future Australian economy, let's look at intellectual property laws and artificial intelligence. I don't know if AI will be the biggest economic transformation in a lifetime, as the head of JP Morgan globally recently opined, or if it'll simply add to the many digital tools we've developed since the early 2000s. After all, it was only 10 years ago that some economists and many more soothsayers and bloggers were convinced that robotics was going to eliminate up to 1/3 of jobs. That hasn't happened. Nevertheless, AI itself may replace a lot of grunt work in document scrutiny and development. But the first time a major stuff-up occurs because a human being didn't check a legal document generated by AI, and that's happened recently in the US, it won't be the lawyer condemned to the scrap heap, it'll be the machine. So AI will be used widely, but the human factor will still be paid to manage the judgment bit wherever trust is required, and that's more often than we might imagine. If that sounds like I think AI will be a bust, I don't. Where AI can be integrated into a location where consumers are comfortable, risks of major stuff-ups are minimal and efficiency gains are clear, it will truly be transformative in my view. Even more exciting though is the use or uses we cannot imagine until some entrepreneurial spirit grabs hold of an idea. Now, what's that got to do with competition policy? Let's imagine that Australia has such a spirited entrepreneur and develops a serious and novel AI capability. We have a handful already of mega successful digital businesses, so it's not that improbable. Atlassian, Canva, Afterpay. If you win big. What will matter for that is our intellectual property laws. Can this innovator's idea be readily protected as an incentive towards investors pouring risk capital in and keeping the idea here locally and rewarding innovators, and so providing a subsequent incentive to others to keep on innovating? And it won't just matter what's in our IP laws, the way other nations treat IP, the protection they give to a product that is effectively dependent on leveraging access to vast sources of someone else's data will be crucial. This discussion will take place globally. It needs to have an Australian voice, one in favour of openness. I think it's accepted in competition policy circles that IP can be both a barrier to entry and a true source of new competitive effort. Gaining recognition in Australia that we need to be part of that conversation as AI takes up regarding IP use is a job for a far-sighted pro-competition reform group, not a thing to be left to IP Australia and the legal bureaucracy to hopefully sort out years down the track. While IP is widely acknowledged as a competition policy issue, impediments to efficiency in the labour market are widely seen as outside the scope. The original Hilmer Review treated them that way. I think, though, there are aspects of the labour market to be brought into competition policy, specifically impediments to the use of qualifications held by migrants. At national and state level, migrant quotas are filled each year for skilled migrants. We assess the qualifications beforehand and we know what they are. Only about a quarter of overseas qualifications held by migrants are actually recognised in Australia. So when migrants seek work, the data from numerous studies, including one conducted recently by CETA, pretty clearly shows a much lower level of acceptance than the assessment of pre-migration suggests. This skills mismatch imposes costs on the economy as a whole and the individuals involved. It's been estimated that this costs the country over $1 billion a year in lost income, but it isn't the most important measure in my view. The most important measure of the loss of innovation and enthusiasm for a career that comes with being rejected due to inflexible state certification. We took these people out of a skilled environment, we brought them here, and we de-skilled them. Today, in my view, it's necessary to see this as limiting the competitive entry of skilled labour. It will not be addressed otherwise. State governments have a clear responsibility that is not being discharged effectively. Then there's health. Let's look further at the non-market economy and specifically at health. In my instinctive judgment, this is the sector where change is the slowest. Risk assessments are used as weapons rather than judgments, and technology offers so much promise. Yet the gains are largest to consumers who have the weakest hand in choosing a service. Efficiency gains only get introduced in health if the gatekeeper providers are happy. We saw this most recently with 6 months prescriptions designed to take the pressure off GPs to some degree, but chemists sarked up and the bulk of any possible savings were redirected back to that sector. Competition policy can and should be used to examine the role of gatekeepers in restricting the use of technology. Let me tell you a bit about telehealth in Australia. You heard earlier that I worked for 4 years on moving the national broadband network from being a back-of-the-envelope concept to a truly transformative technology investment. This gave us all the ability to work and keep studying at home during the COVID years. COVID wasn't something we considered when we were doing our study of potential benefits of the NBN, but telehealth was, or so we thought. And then the Commonwealth Department of Health told us in 2010 that it was opposed to introducing telehealth. It was considered to be disruptive to medical practitioners who didn't want to invest in it, potentially risky in terms of overservicing, and unlikely to attract a population used to face-to-face doctoring. I received this lecture personally. The NBN bill continued out, and yet in 2018, 8 years later, less than 1% of Medicare reimbursements were for telehealth. But the COVID shutdowns and the threat to doctors' and nurses' own health, the digital version of the doctor-patient interface in Australia, courtesy of the much-maligned NBN, roared into life. The then Health Minister soon boasted of 100 million services being delivered over telehealth. Isn't it sad that we had to have a pandemic to see this technology used? And telehealth has persisted into the current environment where there are not enough GPs to meet demand. The ABS says last year 28% of people had a telehealth conversation with a GP. So more than a quarter of people seeking health treatment at one point talked to a screen. 88% of people said they'd use telehealth again, and the reported patient satisfaction index was higher than it was for face-to-face. Digitisation of services will be one way we can lift the productivity of a non-market service like health. Coping with increased demands from an ageing population, new spurts in demand for mental health. The next digital reform line, in my view, will be a set of alternative suppliers assisting the doctor-patient interface. I'd like to say it's AI, but in reality, it may simply be better chatbot algorithms. Your health data held today by your GP can be uploaded to an AI-managed interface before you arrive at your telehealth or face-to-face appointment. And that interface can assist you in a verbal exchange, identify the nature of your problem. Before you think this is all too futuristic, a system like this now operates overseas. It's used for dealing with people's sexual histories and HIV risks in Brazil and in Southern Africa. People are known now to be more willing to share their details of their history with an AI interface than with a doctor. And the doctor is better informed, neutralising this reticence and saving valuable time for future patients. Is this the future? I don't really know, but technology creating new sources of service supply, like telehealth was, less cost, better use of scarce doctor time is a matter for a competition policy agenda. Finally, and I appreciate I'm running out of time here, I will finish up my examples by talking about the mother and mortgages and banking. If you think AI and IP and health was brave, I can assure you the roughest ride of all is in banking. My last report as chair of the PC in 2018 covered competition in the finance sector. It was a funny exercise because of it, and one chaired by my colleague Karen Chester, the competition in superannuation, which overlapped the Hayne Royal Commission. Hayne rapidly drew all ministerial and public attention. It was still going when we finished, so our reports became, through a messy mechanism I won't describe, more akin to a spy movie, as inputs into his. There's no competition here of the Royal Commission. It's simply that, once again, the urgent, a Royal Commission in this case, replaced the essential, more competition in finance and in superannuation. One of our key recommendations to stop the automatic creation of new super accounts, though, made its way into the Hayne report and was adopted. So you take wins where you can get them. What's this got to do with new competition policy? Well, similar to supermarkets, the conditions necessary to be an effective competitor in mortgages are scale, access to a substantial stable source of patient deposits, monetary deposits, and engagement with a customer's intermediary. 70% of the mortgage market is managed now by brokers. The key mechanism to being a successful competitor in the mortgage market is not to get a banking license. We know that the ACCC struggles now to maintain, let alone grow, competitive forces in the amongst the second tier of bankers, as the Suncorp takeover recently showed. So if we look outside the box, which other entities in the Australian financial landscape meet these tests? I can think of one, and that's superannuation funds, where the customer would be the member. There are regulatory impediments to this, the single purpose test. But it's more elite fund boards and managers. With a guaranteed inflow of millions of dollars every week, large super funds simply don't have much incentive to innovate and originate mortgages, so they would have to learn the business. This isn't going to be a walk in the park, but for consumers, having the choice to seek a mortgage from your bank or your super fund would obviously be an improvement on today's arrangements. As an option, not an obligation, an option for APRA-regulated super funds, it creates a threat of entry. And finally, for those who've stuck with me, I'll make some brief comments on the latest big stick. That is the idea of removing and divesting supermarket sites from incumbents. Divestiture is a policy that simply doesn't work. Reality shows that forced divestitures, when implemented overseas, have failed. Either courts threw them out, Microsoft, or the breakup itself became worse. Bell was broken up into baby Bell monopolies and triggered the loss of the great innovator Bell Labs, or, and this is my primary point, the need for constant oversight of the favoured new competitor risks turning the competition regulator from being the keeper of the ring on competitive behaviour to a kind of paternal investor in a particular competitor. We considered this in the supermarket inquiry in New Zealand that I referenced earlier, and the Commerce Commission decided that forced divestiture was indeed a dopey idea. It offers no linkage to price stability, that is, controlling the cost of living, unless a competitor with scale and distribution capacity is available to pay the price to acquire the new site. Craig Emerson, who's reviewing the supermarket code, publicly identified one problem with forced divestiture of supermarket sites, the regulator having to choose the lucky recipient of the divested asset. And that's the small matter of the Australian Constitution. Most of us probably still recall Darryl Kerrigan in the Castle and the previously rarely noticed constitutional provision that the Commonwealth can only acquire property on just terms. In effect, this means a property owner cannot be deprived of their asset unless the Commonwealth pays a market equivalent rate for it. So any divestiture law will presumably be designed to get around the Constitution. There are lawyers who will enjoy that task, I'm sure. They'll benefit, but consumers not so much. You can be sure that there will be multiple well-resourced market participants, not just supermarkets, but big lessors like Westfield, for whom the prospect of being required to lease to the ACCC's preferred party might be unwelcome. Who would legally test that? This policy idea has so many opportunities to fail. Ultimately, though, it's because it won't address the problem. Dominant parties will still be dominant in a concentrated industry. Imagine if the same effort was put into a new national competition policy. We can and should do so much better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now we want to open the floor for the questions. So what competitive policies do you consider will be the most effective at boosting competition in the domestic aviation sector?
This sounds like it's been truly set up for me. I did a report 3 years ago into the slot management system at Sydney Airport, and they asked me to do it because it's one I designed 25 years ago, so I'm guilty of its flaws. So 3 years hence, I think recently the Transport Minister has decided to implement some elements of it. The primary thing that'll boost competition at Sydney Airport, in aviation, is to give greater access to Sydney Airport to new competitors. Right now, the slot management system doesn't give preference as much as it should, to new competitors. And so hopefully we will see the Transport Minister have a go at that. As I said, she's made some announcements, but I haven't seen anything to do with implementation just yet. But Sydney determines in a network business like aviation the ability for new competitors to enter sustainably this market. I think Sydney's still the fourth, or Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane is still the fourth or fifth largest aviation market in the world. And so you can see why, if you can't get access to Sydney, it's very hard to be a sustainable competitor.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move to the next question. What are the implications of the recently announced protectionist made in Australia policy on competition? Do you believe that in its current form, there is a risk of it backfiring and potentially worsening competition within the clean energy and manufacturing sectors?
So yes, I've had some experience with this, and it does go back to the 1990s. There, I remember this is a really sad story. We used to process wool tops in Australia. This is a cleaning and value-adding process. They're effectively sheepskins that get turned into spun wool. We had a producer in Victoria that did this, but the then Australian government decided to bring a French firm out and to subsidise it to make a bigger scale competitor. The French firm failed and the local business failed as well. So what we did was, of course, we brought in this competitor, we split the market between two, neither of them could make money, and so they both went bust. This is a kind of risk with this new advanced manufacturing policy. So I understand why governments are motivated to do this. As I said, noted in passing there, we are in a big transition, and governments feel the need to invest in the transition. But every time we pick a firm to invest in, we deprive another firm of the same opportunity. It's quite a slippery slope.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next question. The next question, okay, let's do this. So you mentioned that the non-market part is the faster growing part than the market economy. And could you provide some more examples and more details on that part? How did one measure that?
Okay, so the non-market economy, the way it's being viewed in the discussion I've had and the Productivity Commission has put together in both my Shifting the Dial and in their more recent 5-year review that I wasn't involved in. So the non-market economy are all those services that are provided by governments as effectively the paymaster. So we're talking education, health, aged care, childcare, the different levels of government themselves, and large infrastructure investments. So this is the fastest growing area, and as I mentioned in the course of my thing, it's driven substantially by both our desire for new and increased services in those areas. That's particularly true of health, and it's driven by demographics, an ageing population ramping up aged care. So it's sort of a material fact and shouldn't be ignored because of this pressure it's putting on the possibility of seeing productivity restored primarily via the market economy, which is where we've been looking so much in the past. It's simply not possible if 25 to 30% of your economy and the fastest growing part is driven by non-market services, not to try and introduce efficiencies there, because that's really the form that productivity takes. And the return won't be necessarily measurable as directly as it will from the market economy. A lot of those benefits will come through increased quality of service. I mentioned in some of my examples the saving of doctors' time via AI and the resistance that patients have sometimes for revealing the truth in a face-to-face discussion that they're happy to reveal to a machine. So those are the sorts of areas where we can introduce efficiencies. But as my example was trying to show, we have good technologies, but gatekeepers are resistant to applying that.
Thank you. There are some questions about migrants, so let's take those questions. So you mentioned that recognition of foreign and or interstate qualification for migrants as an NCP target. How about reform of Australia occupational licensing schemes itself, and should one consider reform there as well? And also there was some question about how do we incentivize basically employees, because in order to effectively use migrant skills, employees' attitude is the important one.
Let me do the second one first because it's simpler. Without doubt, in fact, the data shows, and I referred to a CEDA study, and so it's kind of an interesting thing, but it does show that employers themselves are also resistant to accepting those qualifications. But I'll give you an example, a positive example. Engineers Australia runs a 6-week course for migrant engineers being brought into this country so that they have effectively a stamp of approval from Engineers Australia when they go and see a potential employer. So even if their qualification is accepted by the professional body and the employer, though, says, oh, I'd rather wait for an Australian qualified engineer, Engineers Australia is doing their damnedest to ensure that that migrant engineer has the ability to compete effectively in the market. And that's, to me, a good example of the kind of thing we need. There's a gatekeeper that's trying to make the system work better for the migrants. But so often the gatekeepers are designed actually to protect the incumbent qualification holders and resist the migrant qualification holders. And we simply can't afford that, particularly, this goes to the non-market economy, if we're going to see all these additional people that we'll need to bring in to support us in the non-market areas like aged care and childcare, where we're simply not able to add enough people to our workforce. Again, it's mathematically impossible given the expected demand for those services. In terms of other qualification standards, yes, you could include them, but they don't quite fit my discussion definition today, so I didn't include them.
Thank you. And there are more questions about super funds and new superannuation. So will allowing super funds to offer mortgage create less than desirable incentives that stop governments from slowing house prices down or affordability?
I don't know. I sometimes despair of government in housing policy. I might have mentioned in the talk, I know I skipped over a few sentences because I was running out of time, but I do despair of governments with their intense subsidies of first home buyers, which all they do is drive the price up for everybody in the marketplace, including the first home buyer. And there's so much good data to prove that. But so no, I really I don't think I can answer that one.
Okay, thank you. So, and okay, so what are your views on the Treasurer's recently announced merger reforms?
The Treasurer's, sorry, what reforms? I can see this one.
Recently announced merger reforms.
Oh, the merger reforms.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure governments had to do something in merger policy. I don't doubt that. I was trying to say just that. But this is this question of the urgent replacing the essential. We are always amending and improving the Act, the Competition Consumer Act. We're just not doing enough in national competition policy. So we should be doing both, but we need to put more attention on national competition policy. And if that squeezes out this year, a reform to the Competition and Consumer Act, my view is, well, so it should.
Okay, the next question is about the general insurance area to introduce reform the competition general insurance. So policy akin to what we did for super, which worked better, right? Okay, so I fear a knee-jerk to effective price regulation by government, and price competition is basically elusive for house insurance. So basically, what is your view about area to work on this competition policy about insurance in general?
Insurance was going to be, if I had to put a sixth in there, it was going to be mine because it has been such a massive price increase that people have faced. And it's also a market showing clear signs of concentration. It's just the number of, I didn't really have the space to go and address that, but I would put insurance on the list without a doubt.
Okay, next is about grocery duopoly. As you are aware, is a real issue. And what do you think about this area to introduce competition policy? Yeah. Do you believe there is an argument for forcing the two companies to give up some locations to competition or break down the large corporations in small competitors? What do you think?
Yeah, well, my point was divestment, breaking down large corporations to smaller competitors, simply doesn't work. And it's also highly risky. I mean, the model that was being considered in that course of that inquiry was to effectively trying to create a what I call a monopoly wholesale function. But unless all the retailers were forced to use it, someone would have to guarantee, would have to underwrite that that wholesaler wasn't taking a hell of a lot of risks buying product that simply wasn't going to be placed in supermarkets. This link between wholesaling and retailing shouldn't be broken in that way. And the Commerce Commission, I think, came up with that conclusion. But sites is a far more important thing. And I think in the course of the New Zealand inquiry, they were saying that caveats have been placed on title to prevent sites being sold, once they were sold by a supermarket, from being subsequently used by another supermarket. And that clearly needed to be addressed. And the other thing the Commerce Commission did do, which seemed quite wise, is it's looking at investigating the contracting provisions that occur in supermarket wholesaling. And it's got, I think, a working group examining that. And these things at the margin will make a difference. But overall, the biggest thing that will make a difference is what I call inviting in a competitor at scale, which is really what I described with Kaufland, and the need, I think, the deep desire to discover what it was that drove Kaufland away from the Australian market. I've speculated on what it might have been, but I'm sort of hopeful that the ACCC itself, on an exit interview with Kaufland, which it said it was going to do, knows more than that.
Thank you. We are basically, time is running out. It was very insightful and interesting. Let me just ask one more last question. If you were to choose one pro-competition reform from the list of various policies you discussed today, which one would you recommend to the government?
One reform.
One.
Well, I think it is one to me.
One.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to subdivide this. The one reform is to have a process for pro-competition policies equivalent to national competition policy in the past. How you populate that, I gave those examples because they seem to me to be novel and interesting areas that most people don't consider when they think of competition policy, because they think of what I call classic barriers to entry, licensing provisions, things like that. Whereas this idea, for example, in the introduction of technology, that or the dismissal of qualifications, we have effectively processes that are designed for one purpose, impeding competitive supply that could genuinely benefit the Australian economy in a way that isn't simply, can we license another bank to compete? And so I'm just trying to think more broadly in that. But my one idea is national competition policy.
Okay, thank you very much. We have passed the 5 o'clock limit, and so I think I should wrap up here. Thank you very much, Peter, and also audience. Thank you very much for joining us today. It was very insightful, and see you sometime later again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.